To our Inspire webinar this afternoon. So I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're all meeting today. And for me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. So for those who don't know me, I'm Carolyn Mazurego, and Dr. Nicole Rankin and I are the Inspire co-chairs. I'd like to quickly introduce our two other Inspire committee members, Dr. Mona Ferris and Elizabeth Beasley. And of course, you might already all know Bonnie from the PoCoG office, who's always such a star in helping us set up these webinars. So thanks, Bonnie. And before we actually get started onto the presentations, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to go through. So first, I want to remind everyone to please keep yourself on mute, especially while our presenters are speaking. But feel free, and we actually encourage you to keep your camera on to facilitate at least some engagement with our speakers. I think we can all agree that it's much better to look out and actually see faces than to see a bunch of black screens staring back at you. So during the presentations, you can also use the chat function to ask any questions that you have at the time. But we will be holding a live question and answer session once both speakers have concluded. So you can either continue to post questions in the chat at the end, or feel free to use the raise your hand function and ask a question live. And we also just want to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar. And I guess now on to the topic of the hour, which is systematic reviews. Don't we all just love systematic reviews? I'm sure that we could probably all agree that conducting a systematic review is generally, the first step that's taken before you design or get started with a much larger research project. Specifically in psycho-oncology trials, I guess trials generally, there has been more of a push from funders to ensure that you've described the evidence base appropriately, and that a relevant systematic review has been undertaken in the space before you get started. So with this increasing inclusion of implementation science in psycho-oncology, we thought it would be of great value to hold this webinar and discuss how to best capture implementation outcomes within your systematic reviews. So we have a lineup of two great speakers for you today. The first is Dr. Anna Yugaldi, and the second is April Morrow. And without further ado, we'll get on to the main event. So I'll introduce Anna. Anna is a senior research fellow in the Institute of Health Transformation and School of Nursing and Midwifery at Deakin University. Her research program focuses on the experience of people with cancer and their caregivers through systematic reviews, intervention trials, qualitative and quantitative studies. More recently, her area of focus has included implementation science and health services research, and she's been funded to complete training in the US on dissemination and implementation research and cancer. So today, Anna will be presenting to us her experiences in including implementation outcomes in systematic reviews. So thank you for joining us, Anna, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn and everyone. I'll just share my screen and then we'll get going. Okay. What? Can everyone see that okay? Not quite?
We can see it. It's just not full screen.
It's just not the proper. Yeah. Okay. Let me just try again. Sorry. Just share screen. You'd think that this would be straightforward at this point, but it appears to be on my second screen.
There we go. Perfect.
I don't know why. It's on my other screen, so I won't be looking at you all. I apologize. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for that wonderful introduction. My name's Anna. I'm a researcher at Deakin Uni in Victoria. I am relatively new to implementation science and have conducted a couple of systematic reviews in this area. They've both been huge learning curves. So what I hope to talk to you today is what my approach has been. I'll go through, I guess, the history of systematic reviews briefly, and then I'll talk about how I think they need to morph and just evolve to be suitable for implementation science. And then I'll chat around a few examples, including a couple that we've done. So, oh, all right. Let's go. Okay. So systematic reviews, I mean, they're called systematic reviews because they use these repeatable and analytical methods. And they often and traditionally have summarized efficacy data. So they've summarized the outcomes of a trial, maybe like vitamin D, and they get a whole range of studies together that have had a similar outcome and mesh them together. Meta-analyses have really often been the goal of systematic reviews, I think. So these are what we do. We combine participant groups to get a larger data set. So if studies had been done in people with prostate cancer and breast cancer and lung cancer, you could do a meta-analysis and bring those outcomes together to get an idea of the impact of an outcome on an intervention on an outcome. And that works really well because, as we know, studies can very often be underpowered. I think the Cochrane Group have been really influential in how systematic reviews have traditionally been conducted. And I think this is important to just reflect upon. They've been fantastic in setting up really rigorous guidelines and guidance around how to conduct systematic reviews. But that has all come from focusing on efficacy trials and focusing on kind of getting a key outcome. So the process of a systematic review, I just want to run through this really briefly. I know this probably isn't new information to anyone, but it's about developing up a search strategy, and then you run your search, and then you do a first screen of your titles and abstracts, a second screen of full text, you extract your data, you do some analysis, and you do some reporting and write-up around that. So that's what a systematic review, it is these steps in this process. Traditionally, and Cochrane very strongly advocate for having two people to do all of the steps where they can. So two people doing the screening. I've been advised that they also like to have two people doing the data extraction, which can be really very time consuming and can make it much more resource intensive. But there is this kind of rigor around this kind of systematic review process. But I think it's really important to reflect that systematic reviews are named because of the method. That method and those kind of pillars of that systematic review, especially those three key steps around title and abstract screening, full text screening, and data extraction, that's what makes up a systematic review. But there really is opportunity to reflect on the literature outside of that question of efficacy, although that has really traditionally been the focus of systematic reviews. As we know, implementation science has come quite a long way in quite a short amount of time. I understand like the Implementation Science Journal has been around for a bit over a decade, and there's real opportunity to focus on other things apart from efficacy. And so when we think about that PICO, which is probably familiar to a lot of people, that participants intervention comparison outcome, which we define for doing systematic reviews, I think we can think about that outside of efficacy trials and think about, okay, what's our intervention, or what's our implementation strategies, and what's the comparison, and what's our implementation outcomes as well. And with that, I think it's really important that we evolve our methods that we use. So, and the biggest example of that I've got is risk of bias. Cochrane advocate for this. This is a key step in what they do in efficacy trials. My personal view is that it has less relevance in implementation science trials. I think it has less relevance in maybe some more psycho-oncology trials as well. I don't tend to do it, and I haven't had a reviewer yet kind of address that or have an issue with me arguing that it's not relevant. I also think that we really need a pragmatic approach to conducting the search. What Cochrane and what efficacy trials are able, or efficacy reviews are able to do, is to be really, really narrow around their search. So they can say like outcome and drug, or intervention and outcome, and they can make it so focused that they can get relatively small number of abstracts. But when we're doing things like programs or interventions or seminars or a whole range of things, there's real potential for us to have bigger outcomes and for our searches and our systematic reviews to be pretty meaty. So I just would really advocate that we be pragmatic and adopt the best methods that we can with the resources that we've got. So I'm going to start talking about how these work in implementation science. I know this isn't going to be new to anyone in the Inspire group, but I do just want to touch on it really briefly so we're all on the same page. So when I talk about implementation strategies, I mean the methods or techniques that are used to change practice. So things like teaching or education, or a way to really implement something in practice. And then when we talk about implementation outcomes, I'm talking about an evaluation of whether an implementation was successful. So this is different. This is from Proctor. This is different to the service outcomes that might be measuring whether a service has changed or an intervention is successful. And it's different to the client outcomes that we often would use in psycho-oncology. We're really looking whether things are implemented. So I'll keep coming back to these terms throughout, but that's what I mean by those two. So when we do systematic reviews in implementation science, there's not always this focus. We're not always focusing on efficacy. But with that, the data extraction need to be novel too. So we may need to think about things that we don't normally measure. We might need to be pragmatic and flexible, but we really also want to hold on to that robustness. I don't think we need to feel like implementation science systematic reviews are of lesser quality because they're not doing risk of bias. My view is that that's less appropriate for these studies often. So we do really want to have our methods as robust as possible. There are also a broad range of ways that systematic reviews can be applied. And I'm just going to go through it like 5 examples of those. So the first is collating and evaluating measurement tools. Then we can also, there are systematic reviews that look on the acceptability and suitability of frameworks. There's barriers and facilitators to implementing a new program. Understanding implementation potential is a new one, or understanding how programs can be implemented and making recommendations for how programs best can be embedded into practice. So the first one of those is collating and understanding measurement tools. So this is an example of one of those systematic reviews. This is a really cool little paper that looked at the ways that implementation science outcomes were measured. And it really, I mean, it's a bit older now, I think it's 2015, but it really kind of talked about the importance that we're really rigorous with our measurement within implementation science. And so they got a list of, they worked from Proctor's framework and got together instruments that were measuring those outcomes and assessed them. Example 2, this is a really cool paper again. So this is a systematic review on the suitability of a framework and how it's used. So what these guys did is they did a review on the Epis framework, which is a framework that I'm quite fond of. So this is exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. So different stages of an implementation trial. And what they've done is they've looked at how it is used, how people adopt that framework, what they measure, and it really gave some interesting insights into how this framework can be adapted. So if you're starting an implementation science trial and you think that this framework is relevant to you, you could find this systematic review and look at the ways that this framework has been adopted for other studies, and you can go, oh yeah, that kind of fits with what I was hoping to do. And so it could sort of validate your decision to use that framework. So it's a really handy little trial, really handy little systematic review of how that framework's been used. So the third example of a systematic review in implementation science, this is one by Elizabeth Gerligs, and this was a couple of years old now, not that old, maybe 2019-ish. This is a really fantastic paper. And so they've looked at hospital-based interventions and a systematic review of staff-reported barriers and facilitators to implementation processes. So what they've done is they've looked at how can things be implemented in hospitals, and what are the barriers and facilitators. They came up with 3 categories, which I believe were staff, system, and intervention factors. So what different factors can help support implementation. So if you're doing a study, if you're looking at implementing something within a hospital setting, this is a really fantastic paper to look at. It really provides a comprehensive overview of barriers and facilitators. There's a few systematic reviews on barriers and facilitators, and I just think they're all really great, a really fantastic read for if you're wanting to implement something within those settings to understand what might support that implementation effort. Is a really interesting and relevant read, I think. Example 4, this is a bit of shameless self-promotion here, but this is a paper that we did. This was published back in 2019 around understanding implementation potential. And so the question that had been on me and my team's mind for some time was how practical and how possible is it to actually implement the trials that we're conducting with cancer caregivers. Some of them are very long, very time consuming, a lot of time requirement for the caregiver, but then also for staff to deliver that intervention. So even though there's evidence, there's low to moderate evidence as shown in Cochrane trials or Cochrane systematic reviews that these interventions can be effective, I really was questioning what's the likelihood that they're ever going to be adopted into practice. So we looked at Proctor's framework, and we looked at 6 of those implementation outcomes, and we went back to those trials, those efficacy trials that were really looking to show a difference for an intervention, and we considered whether we thought they were able to be implemented based on success of those criteria. And what we found was that it was really disappointing that, but I suppose not all that unexpected, that not many studies had ever considered how they could be implemented into practice. Only 2 of the 33 papers had involved a consumer, for example. Only 2 of the, so 8% of the studies had thought about potential adoption and made a comment about whether the intervention could ever be adopted. And I think there was about less than a third of cancer caregivers who were eligible were participating in trials on average, which means that if this was going to be implemented, we'd probably have less than that, as we know. That can happen when things are implemented, but there wouldn't be the maybe uptake that you would hope. So it was a really interesting article that I think for me really I guess shifted the direction of my intervention work. And now we're really trying to think about that implementation really early on and go, how can we actually make sure these things get into practice? And this is another example. My 5th example is around understanding how interventions can be implemented. And this is a systematic review of the implementation of patient decision support interventions into routine clinical practice. So they look at going, okay, well, how do we get these things in? What do we have to do to implement patient decision support interventions, which is another approach to systematic reviews. And again, if you were doing a study on a patient decision support intervention, you could imagine reading something like this would be just fantastic to advise you on the implementation strategies that could be most successful. So we've recently just finished another implementation science systematic review, which I'll talk to briefly in a minute, in the last kind of 10 minutes I've got. But I just wanted to highlight my thoughts on developing a systematic review protocol in implementation science. And I think it's just really important to have a clear scope, but iron out grey ideas early. I think you've got more components and more moving parts in a implementation science systematic review than you do to a very traditional efficacy systematic review, because not only do you have those implementation strategies and those outcomes, but you've also got the intervention, and so you need to look at all of those different components. And I'll have an example of that if that's not quite clear at the moment. So have a really clear scope and search and read. And my protocols for systematic reviews, I have one that kind of is a short working one, and then I have a very long detailed one. That's all the information around every grey area and how we're tackling it, just to ensure that real consistency across the team when we're doing screening. I find example papers early. So I find a handful of papers that I know I really want to review and I know will make up my review. And then I try and find about 5 to 10. So it's a meaty number of papers really. And then when I run my trial searches and I'm developing up my search terms, I can see whether those example papers pop up. And that gives me an indication of how successful my search is. And if they don't, I can see what I've done wrong. I can see that what terms that paper has used and how that differs to what I've used. Seek advice and discuss the idea. I can't stress that enough. My thinking around the systematic reviews I've run has evolved so much with discussion and input from others. They're not something that can be kind of done just in isolation. You really want to kind of thresh out exactly what your concept is. And like I said, define those review components. So for a systematic review on how to implement a new model, you'll need to define the model or the program or exactly what you're into, exactly what is being implemented. You'll need to define how you'll measure how it is implemented and also how you extract data around how the outcomes are assessed. So there's just a few more bits to think about, I think. But I'd really advocate for taking some time early on to really work up your protocol. It always takes me 2 to 3 months of work to kind of get it to a point where I go, okay, this is ready to go, and hopefully we can go quicker from there. You want to define your implementation strategies. So the reporting of these can vary so much. And implementation strategies might not be recognised as such. I think this is a really important point. So if you look at those, there's a couple of good papers here. The one that's there, the Powell paper, this was a compilation of 73 different implementation strategies. And this is a fantastic paper to sit down and go, what is an implementation strategy? What are they looking like? And it's got all different examples for them. But there are some things there like startup meetings for studies. And I would say that that's the type of thing that we don't often report when we write up our papers. We don't say, oh, I met with the head of the unit and they were supportive of the study, and then I went to the COO and talked it through with them. We don't go into that much detail, but I'd familiarise yourself with this paper because I think we need to be reporting our implementation strategies in our work. And I know that our word limits and our word counts in papers are always notoriously tight. But I think it's a real limitation of the implementation science field that we're not reporting how we go about, we don't report our implementation strategies. So if you want to assess an implementation strategy or do a systematic review on one, there are papers that can provide structure to what they look like. And this one's a good start, this 73 paper. So then they got together and made it, this is a similar authorship group, and what they did was they combined it into kind of 9 key domains of implementation strategies. So there are some kind of strategies or some frameworks to guide how you describe your implementation strategies. And if you're looking at implementation outcomes, so how do you assess the success of your implementation efforts? Proctor have their fantastic framework. I've used it twice and I just think it's excellent. But you really want to define and operationalize each of those for your review. The other thing I'll touch on is the real challenge of qualitative data when we're assessing the success of implementation efforts and we're measuring implementation outcomes, because of course people can say things in qualitative data that can be very broad and doesn't necessarily belong to one category, but I can speak to that a little bit later as well if you like. And RE-AIM is another really handy framework that's used quite a bit, and that has efficacy in it as well. So I feel like that's a lot of information around my ideas of doing it, but hopefully I'm going to consolidate that with just an example of our review that we did. This is under review at the moment. And hopefully maybe published one day. But it was a big review. It's been going on for some time, so I'm looking forward to seeing the back of it. But this review, what we really wanted to ask is, how can hospitals change practice to better implement smoking cessation interventions? So the hospital is an ideal time to give people support to quit smoking. However, we know that it doesn't always happen. So how can we facilitate that to happen? How can we implement this? So if we think about that, our intervention is the smoking delivery. Our implementation strategies are what's done to get those into practice, and our implementation outcomes are we use Proctor to assess whether that was implemented successfully. So a question, I guess, from a more implementation science perspective is, which implementation strategies lead to successful implementation? Or you could say, what implementation strategies show improvement for implementation outcomes? So we were really looking at understanding the implementation strategies and the implementation outcomes. We didn't measure whether smoking resulted in people quitting. We're not after efficacy or effectiveness of these trials, because there's evidence that they will work. There's evidence that if it's delivered routinely in hospital settings, they'll be effective. There's a Cochrane review on that. But we were looking at how to get it into practice. So we had 3 concepts for a systematic review, and we combined them all: smoking, hospitals, and implementation. They were really long it was a huge search, especially that implementation where we had program and service and nurse delivery and all of these different types of words around talking around how things would get embedded. And we had over 14,000 abstracts. And that was after we limited search by date. So I limited it by 2010. And this is going back to what I was saying very early on. That's not typically considered best practice. I know Cochrane would advocate for never cutting your date, but when you've got, I think we had about, I don't know, 28,000 abstracts or something, and so limiting to that last 10-year period, and we could argue, well, hospital models, we want to use recent ones, implementation science is a relatively new field, but you just have to be flexible to get something that's feasible. I would maybe question whether 14,000 abstracts is feasible after having sifted through them. And then we started categorizing and extracting our data once we had our list of papers. We had about 63 papers representing 56 studies, I think. Implementation strategies were really hard to categorize though. So we started with that 73 list and we wanted to see what was measured, but it was just too hard. There wasn't enough detail in the reporting of the papers to be able to measure it up against those 73. So I scrapped that and I'm like, all right, we'll go back to those 9 categories. That was still too hard. We couldn't quite work out where things that were described sat. So we used planning, organising, leading and monitoring to understand the implementation strategies that we used. So planning was strategies in relation to establishing goals such as stakeholder consultation. Organising was about modifying structures and getting things kind of all your ducks in a row, I guess. Leading was often training and encouraging and enabling people to take effective action, and monitoring was things like audit and feedback. And it's a bit similar to the plan, do, study, act cycle, that kind of thing. This is from an old management textbook around kind of strategies for management. But we piloted that and it was the only thing that really worked well. So that's what we went with. The challenges, we found that the implementation strategies, their reporting and accuracy varied significantly. Some studies would take a page to describe implementation strategies and others would be a line. Implementation outcomes were defined in different ways. So things like if you asked, so nurses would ask, did they adopt smoking cessation delivery, for example? But this could be measured through intention, through self-report, through medical record report, and then you've got these different outcomes and you're trying to bring them together. Like I said, there was a huge number of papers. Study designs were really broad. And I think there's a real issue with understanding and reporting follow-up in these systematic reviews. So if you've got an implementation period of maybe a week and then you measure things 4 weeks later, what's your follow-up? Is it at that you could say, okay, your follow-up's 4 weeks. But then if you've got an implementation period of a year and then a follow-up of maybe a month, yet implementation efforts were happening over that year, it's just quite murky, I think. So if you're doing a review like this, read really broadly and set some clear rules, as clear as you can, and keep piloting and refining your data extraction tools. And by definition, when you do a systematic review, you're bringing together a range of studies. And so you're bringing together just a whole range of things. You're not sure what you'll find. They're different to trials because with a trial, you kind of know, okay, we're going to get to 200 patients and we're going to stop. But systematic reviews are completely on their head in the way that you think you know what you'll find, but you're not really sure. And you're not sure when you get to stop. You don't know if you're going to find 15 papers or 30 papers or 45 papers. And then the impact for how much work you have to do with your data extraction changes with that. And you are bringing together different systems as well. So it's something to be aware of. I'm just going to finish with really quickly question, I guess, reflecting on, I think I'm worried when I was putting this talk together, I'm worried that I've made it sound all really hard and awful. And I think these are such important systematic reviews and there's such opportunity. There's not a lot of them out there. So I think if you're going to take one on, you'll find out what outcomes and measures you can use. You can really guide a whole implementation trial. You could be informed about what strategies will be most successful. So you'll have some information around whether you should do teaching or monitoring or audit and feedback, and you'll get some real ideas around what your strategies can look like. And you could also establish the suitability of a framework to guide your study, which is another great reason. But I would like to just reflect on a few really pragmatic considerations. And when you do a systematic review, the work can easily be shared and delegated across the group. With things like covenants, if anyone is doing a systematic review, have a look into it. It makes life a lot easier. And these types of projects, they can tick along with other priorities as well. So you can screen when you can, and if you've got to do something else for a while, that's okay. You can just keep them kind of going around along with other work. We're doing more and more systematic reviews. I think I've got 6 underway at the moment, just because they're so feasible when our research has been so heavily impacted by COVID. It's been a real challenge to have our studies, from Melbourne, so they've been on hold and then back up and then on hold. And especially when we're partnering with health services. So it's been a real challenge, but we can keep these going whether we're at home, in the office, or whatever. So they've worked out well for us that way. They can result in a high impact paper. I think that there's real potential for us to be able to tell people how to change practice, and that's fantastic. If we can put some guidance and some recommendations into that, that would be most helpful. And as Carolyn said early on, I think these reviews are really critical to inform grants, and we're just going to see more and more implementation science studies. We're going to see more and more hybrid trials, I think, funded through Category 1 funding. So I really think there's a place for these. But you'll answer a really important question with real world benefit. If we can start to be critical and reflect and develop recommendations around how to change practice through synthesizing a body of complex literature, I think that's fantastic. I'm just going to finish with a quote, and this is a quote from the systematic review that we just finished. This is the conclusion. And we found that to embed smoking cessation interventions in hospitals, complex and multi-strategic implementation approaches capable of driving systems change must be embraced. While brief implementation efforts may be viewed as advantageous due to being less resource intensive, their capacity to change practice in a sustained way is questionable. So we really found that if you want to embed smoking cessation in hospitals, please don't do it briefly. It needs to be resourced and considered and developed. You can't just kind of give a half-hour training and then expect everyone to do it forever and for there to be no update. So I think that when we were doing the data analysis, it became clear that this kind of message would emerge from our review. I was really happy because I felt that I think there's real merit in that message, and I think it might be helpful, which is great. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was terrific. I'll hand back to Carolyn, but if I could just get you to stop sharing. Oh, you've done that. Thank you. Back to you, Carolyn.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Anna. It's really great to hear your experiences and your background and the challenges that you face as well. I think it is overwhelming to think about, putting a systematic review itself, I think is quite overwhelming sometimes to take on. But yeah, putting in some implementation considerations and focusing it on implementation, especially when there hasn't been that much in the field already to do this, it's definitely a sort of unknown territory. So thank you for your explanations and sharing your experiences with us. We'll just move on to the next presenter, and then we'll open up the floor for questions after. So Dr. Mona Faris is going to present our next presenter. Over to you, Mona.
All right, so our second speaker for today is April Morrow. So April is an early career researcher, implementation scientist, and behavioural researcher. Her PhD was an in-depth process evaluation of a randomised controlled trial testing approaches to improve the detection of Lynch syndrome among colorectal cancer patients. April's current work focuses on the implementation of a new nurse-led intervention to engage childhood cancer survivors back into the health system. April has over 7 years of clinical experience practicing as a genetic counsellor in the hereditary cancer setting. And her presentation today will highlight some of her PhD work and the methods she took to assess implementation outcomes in her systematic review. And so because April's been experiencing some internet connection issues, she's kindly pre-recorded her talk, which we'll play in just a second, but she'll join us at the end for some live question and answer. So we'll have that set up in just a moment.
So Carolyn, I think the audio isn't working.
Yeah. We'll
Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, let's give this a second go.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction earlier and for the opportunity to present today. So following on from Anna's presentation, I thought I'd share some recent experiences conducting a systematic review with an implementation and theory. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that a lot of the methods I'll be discussing in this presentation were developed as part of a systematic review that I undertook as part of my PhD. And those methods were developed very closely with my primary supervisor, Natalie Taylor. And essentially my PhD was a process evaluation of a randomized implementation trial to improve referral practices for a hereditary cancer predisposition syndrome called Lynch syndrome. And so as part of that, I undertook this systematic review to understand what types of interventions and implementation strategies have been used more broadly in the genetic referral space. And our paper is currently in press with Genetics in Medicine, so will hopefully be published very soon. But I'd be very happy to share it with anyone who's interested. You can just drop me an email. And so we've seen that there's very limited guidance on how to conduct a systematic review with an implementation focus. And as Anna nicely showed, traditional systematic reviews tend to focus on clinical effectiveness. But thinking about it from an implementation science perspective, when an implementation effort fails, if we focus only on clinical effectiveness, we're unable to determine whether the intervention itself was poorly designed or whether that failure was due to poor implementation or perhaps a combination of both. And so when we're in the process of designing the systematic review protocol, in the absence of any real guidance, we try to really align our systematic review methods with the aims of the process evaluation, which was to understand what works, why, in what context, and at what costs. And part of my PhD and process evaluation was also to examine the role of theory in intervention design. And so we incorporated some more novel methods in order to fit that theme as well. And I'll talk through those in a bit more detail later on. But like Anna's team, we also drew upon existing implementation science reporting guidelines, taxonomies, and theoretical frameworks, and thought very carefully about how they might be applied in the context of a systematic review. And so going back to those aims, we tried to capture each of them in our data extraction plan. So we sought to extract quite detailed information about the intervention itself and any accompanying implementation strategies. We also looked at the theoretical basis of the interventions and their intended mechanisms of action, so the proposed kind of active ingredients of success. We also looked at the context in which these interventions were delivered, and specifically we used the Epis Framework to capture implementation outcomes and also capture any additional insights from process evaluation data that might have been reported. And finally, we included the reporting of any accompanying cost evaluations, which is actually also covered in the Proctor outcomes as well. And given that Anna has already provided a really nice overview of implementation outcomes, the next few slides will be focused more around extracting information about the intervention design and also the theoretical methods that we use. So in extracting information about intervention and implementation design, we were really trying to understand what types of strategies are more likely to be effective and whether any specific elements of delivery or design appeared to impact success. And so we used a number of reporting guidelines to inform our data extraction fields. The first was the Standards for Reporting Implementation Studies, or the STARI statement, to ensure that we were capturing key elements of both intervention and implementation design. And if you're not familiar with distinction between those two terms. I'd encourage you to have a read of the paper referenced below, just because there can be some sort of grey areas there. The second one we used was the tidier checklist, just to really pull out the more detailed information about the intervention. So kind of the who, what, when, where and how, and that includes things like the theory and rationale, materials and procedures, mode of delivery, when and how much, so the dosage, and whether any tailoring or adaptations were made. And so one of the more novel aspects of the systematic review were some of the methods that we developed to look at the role of theory in these intervention studies. So we sought to explore whether theoretically informed strategies were more likely to be effective, as well as the underlying mechanisms of successful implementation. So you may be aware that there have been increasing calls for the use of theory in implementation science, and there are a very large number of frameworks that exist. And just one example is the Theoretical Domains Framework, or TDF, which a lot of the methods in this presentation will be focused around. And so systematic reviews can be used to capture whether theory was explicitly applied and in what ways, the active ingredients of an intervention and mechanisms of action being targeted for change. So the intended processes essentially through which these interventions produce their behavioural effects. And also mechanistic or theoretical alignment, which is the extent to which the techniques used to address a specific barrier have evidence of mechanistic links, thereby aligning with the theory of behaviour change. And so before my next few slides, I just wanted to very quickly introduce the Tdf and Bct taxonomy, just to give some context around some of the methods that I'll be discussing in the next few slides. So the Tdf is basically a framework of 14 theoretical determinants of healthcare professional behaviour change. So things like knowledge, skills, professional role and identity, and so on. And these determinants can act as either barriers or enablers. And then on the right, in terms of the behaviour change technique taxonomy, so BCTs are the active components of an intervention with the potential to change behaviour. And this is really just a consolidated list of 93 different BCTs. And so there are quite a number of ways that theory can be explicitly applied in intervention design, and I've provided just one example pathway here. So we start with identification of the clinical problem and the target behaviour for change. And then theory can be used to identify barriers. So for example, different barriers can be mapped to domains of the TDF that we just saw. And then once you've got your theoretical barrier, you can then find behaviour change techniques that are empirically linked to that particular barrier. And then those BCTs can be operationalised as an intervention strategy to suit whatever the clinical context is. And so you can see that through this pathway, theory is being used in a very explicit and structured way to design a theoretically informed and targeted intervention strategy. But even when theory isn't used in this very explicit pathway, it can still be argued that implicit or informal theory is still at play. So clinicians will often identify barriers themselves just based on their intuition and tacit knowledge, and may then design interventions to address those barriers just based on common sense and their own sort of working theory of what might be effective. And so these working or informal theories implicitly developed by the clinicians may or may not overlap with existing formal theories. And it may be possible to essentially work backwards and retrospectively code strategies to assess alignment with existing formal theories. And this is really the approach that we took in the systematic review in studies where theory wasn't explicitly applied, which was in the vast majority of cases. So we essentially looked at the barriers that were described in the text, and where possible, we mapped those to the domains of the TDF. And we then looked at the intervention strategies to see if we could retrospectively identify any BCTs. And once we'd done that, we then looked to see whether those BCTs that were used to address the particular barrier aligned with underlying formal theory. So essentially to see whether there was any empirical evidence of mechanistic links between the two. And so we did that by using the Theory and Techniques tool, which is an online heat map tool exploring the empirical links between a large number of BCTs against a number of barrier domains or mechanisms of action. And this is a freely available tool that anyone can access, and I've popped the web link here. And so I've put a very quick example of how that kind of coding worked. So basically for each study, we went through the text to see if there was any mention of what the barrier was that the intervention was trying to address. So in this case, clinicians forgetting to assess a patient's genetic risk. And then the intervention to address that barrier was the implementation of an electronic reminder system to flag patients who might be at high risk. And so when we retrospectively coded these, the barrier best fit with the Tdf domain memory, attention and decision processes, and the behaviour change technique in that intervention would be prompts and cues. And so after coding these two elements, we can then use the Theory and Techniques tool to assess theoretical alignment. So essentially we select the memory and attention barrier in the top right column, and then the BCT row for prompts and cues. And we can see that that gives us a green square, which tells us that there is a mechanistic link there. And so in this case, the intuitive strategy that the clinicians developed on their own to address the barrier does align with formal theory. But I should mention at this point that this exercise does require adequate description of both the barrier and intervention strategy within the text. And so I thought I'd share a quick screen grab here of how that coding looked in our data extraction spreadsheet. And I should note that this is just a snippet of the Excel table, and we did pull out a lot more information in terms of study and intervention characteristics, as well as implementation outcomes. So looking from left to right, you can see that we've included information about the intervention and target population, as well as the mode of delivery. We've also coded against the ERIC taxonomy, which Anna mentioned. And then we've got the Tdf barrier domains and BCTs. And I should note that interventions often contain multiple BCTs and we're sometimes addressing multiple different barriers as well. We've then noted whether theory was used explicitly or implicitly. And then on the far right, we have the mechanistic links from the Theory and Techniques tool. And so, as you can probably imagine, we had quite a lot of information to then analyse and try and kind of bring together in a meaningful way. And so I thought I'd share some of our key findings just to demonstrate what this kind of information can add to the literature beyond the more kind of traditional systematic review methods. So of the 32 studies included, just over half resulted in statistically significant improvements in genetic referral. 24 articles explicitly stated the barriers that the intervention was trying to address, and when mapped to the domains of the Tdf, the most common barriers were knowledge, environmental context and resources, skills, and memory, attention, and decision processes. And we found that very few studies explicitly made use of implementation science or theoretical frameworks, so only 4 of the included studies. But even though theory was rarely explicitly used, nearly 40% of the BCTs identified showed evidence of mechanistic alignment. And we also found that among successful studies, there were a greater proportion of BCTs with mechanistic alignment compared to the non-successful studies, which suggests that perhaps using strategies that align with theory may contribute to success. And we were able to consolidate these successful strategies into a table that demonstrates their theoretical pathways and could be used as a resource to help other clinicians in the future. We also found that very few studies actually incorporated implementation outcomes in their reporting, and for the few that did, none explicitly used the proctor items, And so the ones that we've listed here were all kind of retrospectively coded to the standardized terms in the Proctor framework. And so based on that, we were able to make some recommendations around that, the inclusion of these types of outcomes in the reporting of future studies. And so to add to some of the challenges that Anna has already pointed out, this was quite a time-consuming process and was done in the context of a PhD. Whereas if I had to do it again, I'd probably need to take a bit more of a pragmatic approach and strip back on some of the data extraction and coding processes. So it's definitely finding that balance there. You can expect a lot of blank data fields. So a lot of the studies weren't reporting interventions in a great level of detail. And as we saw in the last slide, very few incorporated any implementation outcomes. We still included these studies, but we did report that as a finding in itself, which kind of highlights the need for better reporting of intervention studies. And lastly, I should point out that some of the methods that I've described in this presentation may require specific training, particularly around the coding of interventions against the Bct taxonomy. And the link here will direct you to an online free training program that's available. And so to finish off with some take-home messages, incorporating implementation science into your systematic review does require some extra time and planning, but can add a lot of value by enhancing understanding of what types of interventions are more likely to be effective, advancing the field of implementation science more broadly, understanding where the true value of theory lies, because it may be of greater value for addressing more complex barriers, and identifying gaps in the literature and encouraging better reporting of intervention studies. And so that wraps things up. Thanks for joining, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And as I said, feel free to drop me an email if you're interested in our publication or wanted to chat about any of these methods in more detail. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you so much to both our presenters for their presentations. I found them both to be very insightful and eye-opening, especially for those of us considering to include implementation outcomes into some of our systematic reviews that we currently have planned. So I'd like to open the floor now. We do have both April and Anna here with us for any questions that anyone might have. Feel free to pop them into the chat, unmute yourself, raise your hand.
So I'm just wondering, like, what would be a good time frame for doing a systematic review? To either.
I can start if you like. So our review, and I think when I say this, keep in mind that this isn't the only thing we worked on for this whole time. I think that's just the important thing. It's not that much work, and that's the only thing that we did. But I developed up the concept early 2020, and we ran the search by May 2020, and then it's under review at the moment. So I think I submitted it around 12 months after running the search.
Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think ours took about 18 months in total, but we did sort of cast quite a broad net in terms of our running our search, which did generate a lot of abstracts to work through. But yeah, I think all in all, probably about an 18-month period.
Yeah, depends on the topic, I guess, and how many papers you find.
And the big thing, I think, is the length of the data extraction. That's the thing that for me really slowed us down. I think we had more papers than we anticipated, maybe by double, and then having to extract all of that data, took a while.
It does take a long time. I did it once as a research assistant. Yeah.
So if anyone doesn't have a live question, there's one in the chat that just popped up that I can read out. So from Aaron, it says, some great taxonomies listed throughout both presentations. Have either of the presenters come across a really comprehensive taxonomy terms of implementation strategies? For example, all of the different terms a toolkit can be called.
April, do you want to start? I can.
Yeah, I haven't come across anything. I think, yeah, we used a combination of different taxonomies and different frameworks because there wasn't sort of a unified massive framework that covers our every need. So I think it's really looking at what your aims are and what frameworks and taxonomies might suit those aims. And then if need be, using a combination of multiple. Or you might find that, you know, if your aims are just looking at implementation outcomes, then the Proctor framework encompasses all of those really nicely. But, you know, in our case, we were looking at more, you know, looking at the use of theory. And so that's when we had to sort of venture beyond the Proctor framework and, yeah, sort of incorporate multiple different ones.
I think I'd add that for a comprehensive taxonomy of implementation strategies, I think the most comprehensive would be the POW one, which has the 73 papers, 73 different strategies. But yeah, that's a great place to start because I think you can see what strategies might work. But in terms of having a taxonomy of different approaches to the strategies, yeah, I agree with April. There's not a heap out there.
I just saw another question come up in the chat, but as you were talking, I kind of had a question myself. So I'll ask mine and then I'll read the one from the chat. So both of you made mention about the Proctor outcomes and that, you know, you're trying to elicit those outcomes within your systematic review or at least report on those outcomes. But the words, you know, that Proctor uses like acceptability, adoption, feasibility, I mean, those aren't really words that we see within just normal reported studies. And, you know, April saying that you only found 4 of those papers to actually make reference to explicit theory. Are there certain things or are there any resources that you can refer to that can tell you what words or phrases to look out for to look at particular outcomes, like relate them back to outcomes?
I'll start if you like, April. So for both of my 2 systematic reviews in implementation science, we've operationalized that framework. And so we've defined what we meant by each one of those. One of them is published and that's in the paper that I shared. The other paper that's under review, I'd be happy to share our definitions of those if anyone wants them and is really keen to get started on something. But I do think that you need to sit down and go, okay, for my question, what is right? What is a really good fit? What does this actually mean to us? And there's a few things to take in mind. I think it's not only Proctor's definitions of those, but she speaks about the sustainability being a longer term kind of outcome. So for our smoking systematic review, I believe sustainability had to be 12 months after the implementation effort. Otherwise, we said there was no evidence because it is by definition a longer term implementation outcome. So we came up with some criteria that we felt sat very well nicely with our review question.
Fantastic, thanks. Anything to add, April? Should I move on to the next question? Well, the next question is for you anyway. So it's from the chat. Given you were making inferences based on sometimes vague descriptions in articles, did you ever try to contact authors for further info? And was that useful if you did?
So we did when it, in the process of screening for eligibility, whether the descriptions were sort of so vague that we couldn't determine whether a study was eligible or not. In those instances, we did reach out and contact the authors, which had mixed success, a lot of no replies, but we did have a few replies which were helpful. But beyond that, for our data, the actual data extraction, we didn't go and contact the authors because we wanted, I guess we were also looking at the actual reporting of these types of implementation outcomes and the reporting of intervention strategies as well. So in a way, for us to have these for us to have lots of blanks where, you know, descriptions were too vague for us to be able to code anything, I think for us that was an important finding in itself. And so in our write-up of results, that was sort of one of the things that we pointed to, is that a lot of the time these interventions aren't described in in enough detail to really enable replication across different settings.
And Anna, did you, in your experience as well, did you reach out to any of the authors to get more information?
We made a decision not to, and this is another difference. I think Cochrane really advocate for this, and they say that that's what best practice is, and that's what you should do. We made a decision not to, partially because of resources and the amount of time that our review was taking. But I haven't had great success in getting a response, and I think that I agree with April. You know, we need to assess papers on their own merit, and we're getting responses back and detail back from some people, which means their implementation strategies are coded in a different way because we've got extra information. Yet we don't hear from others. I don't know. I think that it maybe interrupts the process a little bit. Yeah, so we didn't, but mostly pragmatic.
Yep, it makes sense. You're already undertaking such a massive piece of work anyway. But back to those like sort of blank spaces, I guess, because I imagine there will be a lot of blank spaces from whatever extraction sheet you set up to actually extract those implementation outcomes, because of the fact that we just talked about that studies don't report really detailed descriptions of their implementation strategies or interventions. So what does that end up looking like, I guess, in your paper? Is it just blank tables, or basically just saying in these we found 50 studies, only 4 of them are reported, here are the 4 that we were able to extract on, and it's just like a note basically that you're saying there's a really a big evidence gap in terms of the reporting?
I think that a thing to start on is to remember that we don't need every implementation outcome to be measured, and I don't think that's what we're asking anyone to do. So it's okay if some people have chosen to measure the acceptability or the feasibility or the sustainability, but not the penetration or whatever. I don't think we necessarily need all of them, and this is something we really struggled with. What is implementation success? Is it the number of implementations that were measured? Is it having one that's very successful? And in the end, we just adopted a real narrative approach and kind of tried to synthesize the data and bring it all together as best we could. So there were certainly a lot of gaps, but I think that I think that we still were able to navigate that. And I don't know if it's that different to an efficacy trial in this way, where you'd have gaps around secondary outcomes and things if you were looking at those. Yes, so look, it was an issue, but we were really looking at what was there and what was measured, and where there was evidence. We also, I guess the last thing to say was, we tried to really emphasize throughout our results and discussion where things were not reported as opposed to not done, because I think that there were things that were done but not reported.
Anything to add, April?
No, I think, we took a very similar approach with Anna's team, and it's just one of those things where you sort of have to accept that you might not have data for every single field that you put together in your extraction, and that's okay, but it's something that you can report on as well.
Fantastic. Nicole, I see your hand up. Go ahead. You have the floor. Thanks,
Carolyn. I'm just wondering, Anna or April, whether you looked at, rather than risk of bias, at critical appraisal tools. I've been working on a systematic review for about 18 months as well. For the team I'm working with, it was actually quite useful to use the Joanna Briggs Institute measures of critical appraisal, because they, in a sense, are not looking at so much the risk of bias in the sample, but instead appraising the study designs. And I found that to be really useful. And I'm just wondering if either of you wanted to reflect on your experiences around that.
April, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So we used Qualsist because we did include studies that had both a qualitative and quantitative components, and so that was sort of the best tool that fit our kind of methods. But I did come across the Joanna Briggs Institute one, which looks really helpful. I did, I found Qualitative to be helpful to an extent, but I think in future we'd probably look at.
Oh, April, you just went on mute there. Are you done? Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry about
it was
that.
just right at the end. We didn't, Nicole, and the reason was mostly pragmatic because we had just so much data. It felt like we had each of our implementation strategy categories around that: planning, managing, planning, leading, organising. We had those. We had to describe the intervention itself, so how smoking was delivered, and then we also had all of the proctor outcomes as well. So it was mostly pragmatic. In future reviews, I'd certainly look into it. Absolutely. I do think that, and I said this during my talk, but I mean, risk of bias, I think that traditionally belongs to meta-analyses, and that the reason that's there is so that once you consolidate those trials, you can tell which ones within that meta-analysis came with bias. So yeah, I think that it just doesn't belong unless you're unless you're doing a meta-analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. We had a very similar experience. It's looking at the implementation of interventions for reducing diagnostic delay in lung cancer. And so we similarly had 11,000 abstracts to review. We managed to get it down to 54 studies. And because that took such a long time to extract all the data, we ended up after 12 months having to rerun our search strategy. And while we only identified an extra 6 studies for that year period, it was really important for us, I think, just to be able to say, okay, we've done the update and we've done all the critical appraisal for those 54 studies, but it was a massive undertaking. So I can appreciate that leaving some of those tasks to smaller review with a smaller number of studies is perhaps the way to go. But other people on the call might like, or in the webinar might like to comment on any of their experiences too. So please pop your questions in chat or feel free to raise your hand.
No one else has an immediate question. I can ask another one. So I'm actually really interested, April, in the idea of theory versus non-theory, implicit versus explicit. And I think that you said it yourself, it's like one of the novel things of this review that you've done. So I don't know if you can comment on, if you found big differences between the types of strategies that were theory-based or non-theory-based, or I guess we as researchers kind of assume that using a theory is always better, but it might be a question that a review could answer in some sort of way, or another study could answer.
It was difficult in our study because in our sort of review, because there was only one study that explicitly used theory in intervention design. So we didn't have much to compare with, unfortunately. But I think perhaps if there were more studies that were using theory explicitly, then we'd be able to sort of draw, better comparisons to see whether the strategies between the two groups were similar or different.
Fantastic, thanks. So there's another question that just popped up in the chat to either of you. So how did you assess the quality of individual studies included in the review?
April, do you want to start?
Yeah, so we use the Qualitative tool, essentially.
And we didn't kind of formally assess study quality. And look, it's a tricky one, because I think for our review, things that typically might indicate good quality maybe were less important. So maybe like a giant sample size. So data could be collected from people who received the smoking intervention. It could be nurses, it could be clinicians. And just because there were a small number of clinicians who really critically evaluated the implementation efforts, I don't think that meant it was less quality. so we made a decision not to. We did record things like sample size and numbers of people who went through and what the implementation looked like, but those kind of traditional concepts of quality, I felt I feel like they would have been designed for efficacy and even effectiveness studies rather than implementation trials. And I think the qualitative work had such strength in my review, and they were smaller sample sizes and things like that. So yeah, we didn't do it.
Another question for either of you as well. So, I mean, we all plan systematic reviews, as I said, as a starting point to much larger research programs. I'm interested to know your schools of thought, I guess, in whether or not every systematic review should have an implementation component if it is your end game, I guess, to actually develop or implement a clinical intervention. And I think both of you took quite robust ways of, pushing through a systematic review that specifically looked at implementation outcomes. Would you recommend to add on a couple of implementation considerations into a normal, like a straightforward systematic review that you have planned already?
April, do you want to go first?
I think yes. As I said, it does take a bit of extra time and planning, but I think it's a good idea, and I think a lot of other people can learn from that as well. So
I would say yes, but maybe with caution, because I think things just have to be manageable. They do have to just be practical, and you can't get yourself in a position where you're halfway through a review and can't keep up with it and need to rerun the search, and by the time you've done that, you need to do it again. So if you were going to add a few on, I'd do it in a very kind of defined and structured way. But I think they're so absolutely added on, but I would also ask whether it's a standalone review, asking how do we implement this? How does this work by itself? And that's okay as well.
And along the same lines, what are your thoughts of updating, or, well, not really updating, but coming, there are so many systematic reviews that currently exist that haven't looked at implementation outcomes. So taking a systematic review in your field that already synthesizes the clinical effectiveness of whatever it is that you're trying to, move forward with, and go back and do a implementation review of those studies, is that a worthwhile project as well?
I'll jump in and say absolutely. And we've tried to do that before, but we just got slow with it. And unfortunately, then the paper that we were basing a review on became a bit old. So then our review by definition was old. I think because of that gap between running a search and publishing it, and then finding it, and then building your own protocol, there can be a little bit of time, maybe a few years. But I think if you're fast, I don't know, I think we need to be pragmatic and clever. And if there's opportunity to take another person's search, take another person's screening, and get a list of studies and assess them for implementation potential, that's fantastic. I really do think that. And I would also question, does it matter that that search is absolutely not 100% up to date? Well, no, maybe not, because you're reflecting on how the status of those kind of trials have been developed at that time and whether they had implementation kind of considerations. But I think we need to think more, more strategically around how we can do things like that.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions from the crowd, those of us in attendance today? I've just given you all an idea for future research of your own. But if there aren't, I guess we can wrap up a bit early. Everyone likes some extra time in their day. So I'd just like to thank both of our presenters today so much for giving us their insights. I'd also like to thank the Inspire committee for helping to put this webinar together, and the PoCoG admin group as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. It is recorded, so we can send out a recording of this webinar. And as always, thanks again for being part of the Inspire group.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thanks for having us.